Welcome to Life Stories, where we share inspiring tales of hope, resilience, and transformation. Today's story follows Linda, a 60-year-old woman who, after years of accepting a life without children, finds herself carrying a miracle that defies every expectation. But as she embraces this unexpected blessing, her marriage is put to the test. This is a story of love, doubt, and the profound lessons that life teaches when we least expect it. Join us as we journey through Linda's life-changing experience. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to start today's journey. My name is Linda, and for most of my life, I had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythms of a life without children. I was 60 years old when I came to accept that motherhood was not a part of my destiny. I had experienced the joys and sorrows that life had to offer. But in the end, I had come to terms with my solitude. The house I shared with my husband, Richard, was small, neat, and well kept, but its silence spoke volumes about the years that had passed. Each day began with the same calm rituals. We shared a cup of tea each morning. As we had for decades, the sun would rise slowly over the small town, casting a warm golden glow across the street, while Richard would read the paper, and I would watch the birds flit from tree to tree outside our window. Our walks in the park, where we'd stroll slowly through the rows of trees and flowers, had become second nature, as much a part of our routine as breathing. Evenings were spent reminiscing over old photographs, flicking through the albums of our youth, laughing at the memories of a time when our world felt so full of possibility. It was peaceful, but if I'm honest, there was a part of me, a secret part, that wondered if life might surprise me. I longed for a miracle, a change. Something that could fill the silence of my years with something more, something unexpected. But those thoughts stayed hidden, tucked away in the back of my mind, as I carried on with the days that felt both full and empty in their own ways. It wasn't until one crisp autumn morning that something inside me shifted. It came suddenly, this sensation, unlike anything I had felt before. It wasn't the gentle ache of old age, or the discomfort of a body that had lived for 6 decades. No, this was different. It was more than just a flutter or a mild discomfort. It was as if something had awakened deep within me. My heart raced with a feeling I couldn't fully understand, excitement, fear, and wonder all mingling together. A thought blossomed in my mind, slowly taking root. Could I be pregnant? I didn't want to believe it at first. It was so out of the realm of possibility. At 60, with a life of routines that had been established long ago, the idea of carrying a child seemed absurd. Yet, as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling. I began to wonder, with both trepidation and hope, if this could actually be true. I had to tell Richard. I had to tell someone. One evening, as the sun set, casting a pink hue across the sky, I sat beside Richard on the couch, my heart thudding in my chest. He glanced at me from over the newspaper he was reading, a quiet curiosity in his eyes. It was then that I spoke the words that had been churning inside me for days. Richard, I said softly, my voice trembling slightly, I believe I'm carrying a child. The words hung in the air between us, fragile and full of possibility, but also uncertainty. Richard looked at me, his brow furrowing slightly as though he hadn't quite understood what I had said. Then, his lips parted, and he laughed, a short, disbelieving laugh. You must be joking, Linda, he said, his voice dismissive. At your age? It's impossible. His laughter, meant to be light-hearted, carried an edge of disbelief. It stung, more than I had anticipated. He couldn't see what I felt, couldn't understand the strange, tender connection I already had with the life inside me. I watched him closely as his eyes narrowed in a way that told me he couldn't even entertain the thought for a second. There was no space for miracles in his world. Only what was rational, what was expected. A wave of doubt surged through me. I had shared my hope, but it had been brushed aside as something laughable. Was I being foolish? Maybe this was just another sign of the fantasies I clung to. A last-ditch attempt to find meaning in my later years. But even as I looked into Richard's eyes, his expression one of pure disbelief, there was a small part of me that refused to let go of the possibility. I couldn't shake the thought that something extraordinary might be happening, something beyond reason. So, I kept it to myself, at least. For the time being, I had to live with the secret. This tiny flicker of hope that seemed impossible, yet undeniable. Each day, as I stepped outside and breathed in the crisp autumn air, I felt it grow stronger. The sensation of life within me, strange and wonderful, continued to stir. There were mornings when I woke, my body heavy with the weight of what I was carrying. But I wasn't ready to share it again. Not yet. Richard had already made up his mind, and I couldn't bring myself to face the ridicule a second time. Instead, I focused on the small moments. The details that had always filled my life with quiet meaning. The scent of tea brewing in the morning. The sound of the leaves rustling in the park. The hum of the old clock on the wall. They seemed to take on a new significance now, as though everything in my life was preparing me for the miracle I couldn't yet fully grasp. But still, I nurtured it within me. A secret that no one else could understand. I had lived a life of gentle perseverance, finding comfort in routine and the quiet moments between the major events of my past. Yet now, there was something more, a quiet hope that perhaps, just perhaps, my story wasn't over yet. That life, in its mysterious ways, could still surprise me. As the days passed, the secret that I carried inside me became harder to ignore. At first, I had hoped it might remain a quiet miracle, something I could nurture in solitude. But the changes in my body could no longer be dismissed as the inevitable quirks of aging. There were subtle shifts, tenderness, a sense of fullness, a faint flutter in my belly that came and went, like the stirring of a bird's wings. It was not just my body that had changed, but something deeper within me. Yet, every time I tried to bring it up with Richard, I was met with the same dismissive response. The soft, barely there smile I offered him in the mornings seemed to fade each time I glanced at him, wondering if today would be the day he would accept what was happening. But it never came. The disbelief in his eyes never wavered. It became a silent war between us, my growing hope and his steady refusal to entertain any possibility of the impossible. I found myself withdrawing, retreating into my own thoughts more often, trying to find meaning in the life I was nurturing within me, even though it was unseen by the one person who should have shared this with me. Every time I mentioned it, his reaction was the same. A quiet chuckle, then a dismissive, "Linda, you're mistaken." In those moments, it was as though the bond we shared was slowly unraveling. He couldn't understand my excitement, my secret joy, and what hurt most was that I couldn't convince him. Richard, my husband of many years, was a man of logic, of practicality. For him, there were no miracles, no exceptions to the rules of nature. But for me, I clung to the belief that life had a way of surprising us, even when we were least expecting it. I started writing in my journal more, documenting the tiny changes in my body, the little shifts in my thoughts. It was the only space where I could fully express my joy, my hope, my fear. Without the weight of Richard's disbelief pressing down on me, I would sit by the window in the mornings, watching the world outside, thinking about the life growing inside me. The sun would filter through the leaves, casting shadows that seemed to dance in celebration. Every small moment felt imbued with meaning, as if nature itself was participating in this miracle. Even when Richard was near, I felt a distance between us. He remained distant, not just physically, but emotionally. His skepticism about the pregnancy had become a silent barrier, one that I was beginning to feel the weight of every day. What had once been quiet understanding between us was now clouded by his growing unease. It wasn't malice, I knew that, but it was a deep-seated fear, a fear of the unknown, of something he couldn't control or explain. There were moments when I considered keeping it all to myself, retreating fully into my secret world. But I couldn't. I needed to believe in the miracle that was unfolding within me. I needed to hope that, somehow, Richard might come around. Yet, every day that passed without him acknowledging what was happening inside me, I felt the gap between us widen. The tension was palpable, yet I clung to my quiet hope. That stubborn, unyielding belief that maybe, just maybe, life would surprise us both. But Richard's continued refusal to entertain the idea had already begun to unravel something deep inside me. I was slowly realizing that the road ahead might not be as simple as I had once believed. The growing distance between Richard and me was becoming harder to ignore. And yet I held on to the belief that somehow, a miracle was still within reach. The days passed, and the weight of what was happening inside me became more evident. Both to myself and to Richard. I tried my best to hide the changes from the world, to preserve my secret for as long as I could. But the physical signs of my condition were now undeniable. My body, once steady and familiar, had become a living testament to something extraordinary. The gentle flutter of life within me had turned into more than just a quiet whisper, it was a pulse. A reminder that something miraculous was growing inside me. But Richard refused to acknowledge it. Despite the small changes, despite the way my body had shifted in subtle ways, he remained adamant in his disbelief. Each time I shared my excitement, each time I tried to speak of what was happening, I was met with cold dismissal. "Linda, you must be mistaken. You're too old. This isn't possible," he would say, his tone laced with frustration. His words, though not spoken with cruelty, felt like daggers, slowly chipping away at my spirit. I wanted so badly for him to see what I felt. To understand that what was growing inside me was not just a physical reality but a profound emotional experience. But Richard refused to see it. In his mind, miracles didn't happen. He clung tightly to reason and science, to the world as he understood it. And in doing so, he rejected what was happening to me. It was as if the very miracle that had blossomed within me had become something unspoken between us. A secret I could no longer share. But even as Richard continued to dismiss it, my body spoke louder than any words could. Each morning, the weight of the truth settled a little deeper. The unmistakable shift in my form was undeniable. I felt the stirrings inside me grow stronger. And though it filled me with both joy and fear, I began to prepare for the unimaginable. The quiet hope I had held onto now felt more like an overwhelming anticipation. But it wasn't just about the miracle I believed was taking shape inside me. It was about how it would change everything. Not just for me, but for Richard too. I had spent years with him. Our lives intertwined by shared routines and quiet moments. But what if this miracle could bring us closer? What if it could break down the walls of skepticism that Richard had so firmly built around his heart? As the days turned into weeks, I found solace in the small moments. I would walk alone in the park, finding comfort in the rustling leaves and the steady beat of my own heart. The world seemed more alive to me now. Every detail more vivid, as if I were seeing it for the first time. The simple act of breathing felt sacred. And I began to view every quiet, ordinary thing as part of something larger, something full of hope and promise. I knew Richard still didn't believe me. And each time I tried to bring it up, he would simply shake his head, lost in his skepticism. But I could feel the distance growing between us. And with it, the fear that he might never understand. The weight of his disbelief pressed down on me. And yet I refused to let it overshadow the miracle that I knew was coming. It wasn't long before my body could no longer hide what had been growing inside me. The signs were too obvious now, too loud for even Richard to ignore. But what had once been a quiet secret, a flicker of hope, had now become an undeniable truth. And though I knew the world would never look at me the same way again, I also knew that the life inside me, this miraculous child, was my own. No matter how the world responded, I held on to that truth with all my heart. What came next, I didn't know. But in that moment, as I looked out the window at the changing leaves, I realized that I was ready for whatever life had in store. I had already discovered that life's greatest lessons came in the most unexpected of ways, and this miracle was no different. The day finally came. It wasn't a dramatic moment marked by fanfare or grand expectations. It arrived quietly, like a breath held in anticipation, only to be released into the world with a force that neither Richard nor I could deny. The small signs that had been building within me for weeks, the sudden changes, the growing life within, had all come to fruition in the most unexpected way. I woke one morning to an unmistakable sensation, sharp and sudden. I knew immediately what it meant. It was time. The hours that followed were filled with a mixture of anticipation, fear, and the quiet excitement of what was about to unfold. I sent word to a few trusted neighbors, those who had noticed the change in me over the past few weeks. Those who had quietly supported me through this journey without saying a word. I needed their presence, their strength, even though Richard remained distant, unsure of what was happening. In the moments before the birth, I found myself standing alone in the living room, looking at the old photographs that lined the walls. The faces in the frames were familiar, warm with the memories of years gone by. Richard and I, younger, full of hope and possibility, were captured in those images, frozen in time. But now, things were different. The life inside me had changed everything. It had shifted the balance of our lives, forcing us both to confront truths we weren't ready for. Richard was still in the house, moving about in the background, but he was no longer the man I had known. His presence, once comforting and steady, had been replaced with tension and unease. He was pacing, unsure of what was happening, and perhaps afraid. His skepticism hadn't wavered, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something raw, something vulnerable, perhaps even regret, though he never spoke of it. I could feel his unease radiating through the house. But I wasn't about to let that ruin the moment. The miracle that had been growing inside me was now at the threshold, ready to make its entrance into the world. Despite everything, I held on to the belief that this life, these tiny miracles, were worth the struggle. The pain was sharp, relentless, but as the hours passed, it became clear that this was more than just physical labor. It was a test of will, a proving ground for everything I had believed. With every contraction, with every breath, I thought of the life inside me, how this child was a symbol of hope, defying every expectation I had ever held. It was a sign that life could still surprise us, even when we thought it had nothing left to offer. As the sun set, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, the moment I had anticipated for so long finally arrived. The room seemed to hold its breath as the first cries of the twins filled the air, loud and full of life. In that moment, everything I had known about myself, about life, and about Richard, shifted once again. The sound of those cries was a testament to everything I had hoped for, and everything I had been too afraid to fully believe. Richard, who had remained distant throughout, now stood at the door to the room, his face pale and his hands trembling. He couldn't hide his shock, his disbelief at the miracle he had denied. The twins were here, and their cries were a defiance of every doubt he had ever held. He looked at me, as if trying to understand how this could be possible. But the miracle was undeniable, and the truth was now staring us both in the face. It was in that moment that I realized something profound. I had always believed in the power of hope, in the possibility of miracles. But now, I understood that it wasn't just about the miracle itself. It was about what we chose to believe, and how we chose to embrace what life offered, no matter how impossible it seemed. As I held my newborn twins, I knew that everything had changed. But what I hadn't expected was that the change would go beyond the miracle of their birth. It would unravel the very foundation of my life with Richard. The rift that had already begun between us was now undeniable, and what I had feared would happen had finally come to pass. Richard's disbelief and skepticism had torn us apart, leaving us standing on opposite sides of a truth neither of us had been ready to face. In the quiet aftermath of the birth, the reality set in. This miracle had brought new life into the world, but it had also revealed the fracture lines in my marriage. As the days turned into weeks, the miracle of my twins continued to fill our home with joy. But there was an unspoken weight in the air, an invisible divide between Richard and me that could no longer be ignored. Despite the love I had for my children and the strength I found in them, the rift between us grew. Richard's suspicions, his doubts about the miracle, slowly consumed him. He couldn't accept what had happened, and in his refusal to embrace the truth, he pushed me further away. The final break came one afternoon when Richard, filled with resentment, whispered words I will never forget. "I can't live with this lie anymore." His accusations of betrayal, of infidelity, shattered what little was left of our bond. And so, we parted ways. The divorce was finalized quietly, like the end of a chapter I had never imagined would come to such an abrupt close. Though heartbroken, I found peace in the quiet moments that followed. With my twins by my side, I rebuilt my life slowly, day by day, drawing strength from the miracle they represented. I transformed the garden into a vibrant space, and with each new bloom, I healed. Richard, too, would walk a long road of self-reflection, filled with regret and questions that haunted him in his solitude. Yet, as time passed, I understood that healing was a journey for both of us, one that would unfold in its own time. In its own way. Thank you for following my story. If you've enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring videos. Stay tuned for more tales of resilience, redemption, and hope.